interaction with cities mean. And I've thought a lot about this vis-a-vis the work that each of you, which is quite different, and yet there's something about being viscerally interactive with the world. And I just came from the session on AI. And no matter what you say, AI cannot viscerally visit the world or be in a city in the same way. You don't look anyone in the eye. So I hope that we have a chance to kind of explore that and how that has affected people. The session was called The Flaneur and the City. I did look up and think, well, what does flaneur really mean? I don't know that this is what it really means. I hope that we will disrupt this part of it. Because to me, it talks about the artist-writer Jenny Taylor explains that the flaneur has the ability and the time to wander society while also being removed from it. His purpose is to observe society and only that, and he therefore appears aimless. We'll come back to that. The flaneur, a poet in the streets, sees the world through a kaleidoscope, finds solitude in a crowd, delights in anonymity. But he treats everyday life as its own creative space, strives to demand the immediacy in observing the fleeting in the moment in which they occur. Now that part, I thought, rang true. The aimlessness is the part that I thought, no, these are people with, I'm not sure if in Urdu they use the same word, niat. Is that in it, I speak Indonesian, so that the idea of intentionality seems to me what I hear in all of your works. So what we thought we would do is ask just to familiarize each of you with the speaker's works, have them do.
It started, as the story goes, with fire. A burning that kept drawing me out of bed, that brought me to the page, that made me write even though I had no idea where it would go. This will be my little secret. No one will know, I told myself. And with the cloak of quiet, I let myself be invisible. Invisible enough to write, to let come what come, to release what I needed. When it came through as lyric, in bursts, in spurts, fragmented, like my character's mind. It was fiction, but it felt true. That's as much as I can say about that. It was broken, but it felt true. The lyric filled the gaps in my characters, let them tell their own story, let it hook in them and write. And I let each line lead me, carve a path that I, as a writer, followed and followed. I followed the candle in front of me, and I let it illuminate what it needed to illuminate. The story that needed to come arrived. The lyric allowed it an opening, and I sat and tried to catch what I could. Who knows where characters come from, other than when they come forth, there's no deniability of their truth. Has this character lived inside me forever? Have they all? Are they all clamoring to be heard? Do they love me for telling their stories? Do they hate me when I get it wrong? When I was in college, I had a teacher named Talia Field who taught a class on a lyric essay. One of our first assignments in class was to each have a string that represented a line on a grid, something about the y-axis and the x-axis, invoking a kind of math I had learned in high school that I'm not sure I ever fully understood. On either end of the string were things that were polars to each other, fact versus fiction, content versus form, lyricism versus narrative, individuality versus collective, etc. We placed these pieces of string all together, making a map of the different ways to be a writer. Each one of us had to stand where we thought we existed on the grid, our own unique combination. It's interesting how binarily we approach anything, this versus that, as though only one can exist and the other has to be banished, as though we could only occupy a oneness, making ourselves easy to be categorized by the world around us, easy to be understood, classified, to be consumed. And when we don't fit the idea of the world's consumption, how easy then we are to be disposed.
Started my platform, my page, out of frustration. Pakistan was basically in the news for all the wrong reasons. Shower attacks had happened, Malala had gotten shot in the head. Even our cricket team was getting badnaam in a series of betting scandals. So that's how I started just posting about everyday life. I was like, I want to show people what happens over here, everyday things. So this was during the summer of Black Lives Matter, and I'm also a doctor. So I was on this polio drive deep in Balochistan, and my colleague and I was having a very impassioned discussion. It was kind of like a TED talk where I spoke for 15 minutes straight, and I was like, Black Lives Matter, and look at what's happening and all this stuff. And my colleague looks at me, and she looks at me in 2-3 minutes, and she says, Bilal, you are full of shit. And I was like, excuse me, I don't understand. She's like, you are the Pakistani straight white male. I was like, I don't understand. She's like, why do you care about Black Lives Matter? Why don't you talk about Pakistan? What happens here? I was like, I think you'll have to break it down for me. She's like, I will break it down for you. Don't worry. She's like, gender. How do you identify? Are you male? I was like, yeah, him. Great. She's like, we're going to get deeper now. She's like, religion. Shia, Sunni. I was like, oh, this is getting intense. I was like, Sunni. I was like, that's a lot of privilege there. She's like, are you born with privilege? I was like, I think so. She's like, do you speak English fluently? I was like, yes. She's like, okay, now let's get down to ethnicity. I was like, I was like, you're getting very personal here. And she just goes straight for the jugular. She's like, are you Punjabi? And I was like, you're getting very personal. She's like, look, I'm just talking about demographics here. 48 to 52% of Pakistan is Punjabi. So like, there is an element of privilege here. I was like, no, I'm not. I'm from Karachi. And yeah, so she's like, okay, you are male, you are Sunni, you speak fluent English, you're privileged, and you're born in Karachi. That's a lot of privilege there, Bilal. She's like, I am female, I'm Shia, and I'm Baloch. And she's like, if I get found dead in a ditch, nobody would care. You will make national headlines. She's like, why do you care about Black Lives Matter? Why don't you talk about us? What is happening to us? And all of a sudden, it was at that point where my entire worldview and view of my place in Pakistani society just changed. And I just realized that what my privilege is in Pakistan and how I should be using it. So that was my...
From Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and now lives in Newark, USA. Her debut novel, American Fever, was published in 2023 and won the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature and South Asian Book Award. Her work also appears in the New York Times, Financial Times, and Al Jazeera, among others. She was selected as Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2022 and won the 2019 Financial...
Moderating this, very excited to be here. Given the topic of today, so my debut novel, American Fever, is the story of a young Pakistani girl who moves from urban Pakistan from Rawalpindi to a very rural setting in the United States, in rural Oregon, for an exchange year. And so given the topic for today, I'm choosing a passage that sort of talks about cities and the difference between cities in the two places, or actually not inside, because she's in Oregon, she's in a rural setting, but her experience of navigating the public space in the two places. So that's the first small excerpt. That's I think all you need to know. She's attending high school there. After the season ended, I began taking walks in the afternoon. making my way down the hill and onto a side road where a spring ran. Walking around Lakeview was a joy, meditative and mindless, like moving the beads on a rosary. There was seldom anyone on the streets, the only thing to be wary of the occasional car rushing down the highway. I had never walked for leisure back home, where the streets were made for people like my family who owned cars. In the market, Ammi often waited for someone else to pull out so she could park right in front of the store. Uncle Shafiq was instructed to drop me off as close to the school gate as possible. The brief moments I did spend on the streets were a cacophony to the senses, looking out for erratic motorcyclists and blindly reversing cars, turning this way and that to avoid the sprawling bodies of men, adjusting my dupatta so it didn't sweep the floor. Each foray out of the car was a 10-second odyssey.
As a public space, and then how that translates and comes into informing your work. Would you start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So this is something that I think a lot about. Some of it is in this novel. I've also written essays about this, and it's something that I constantly think about, both in the Western context. I live in New Jersey, very close to New York, and also, perhaps more so, in the Pakistani context. So I think, to me, such a big part of the modern Pakistani story is about the rural-urban divide, and particularly the rural-urban migration. I think perhaps most people in this room, if you trace 2 or 3 generations back, someone at some point left a village, right? And there's some kind of ancestral homeland that perhaps some people are no longer connected with, but a lot of people still are, and what that has meant for our society, for some of those fabrics to loosen, and then for others to form. And so I think about the urbanization and how that has sort of taken away from an older, of course, a lot of that is right, natural, as you might call it. I think perhaps the interesting, exciting, perhaps sometimes devastating thing is that it has happened at such a breakneck speed in this part of the world. So there's one is that. And 2, the other reason why I think a lot about that, and which is also sort of mentioned in this passage that I wrote, is the experience of being a woman in Pakistani public spaces. And I know there's a good amount of conversation about this, the fact that there are very few women, which, I would encourage us to sort of push back against that, because there are women in our public spaces. A lot of the times there are women of a lower class who have to daily commute to the places where they work as house helpers, where they're nurses, where they're dining hostesses, where they're receptionists at banks. So there's a lot of women who are constantly navigating public spaces. I think the difference is very few women are allowed to loiter on the street. So that's the difference, right? You are allowed to frantically run through a street, or like quickly make your way to your workplace or back home. But what you are less allowed to do is to sort of just be on the street for the sake of it, which is exactly what the flâneur does. The flâneur isn't commuting. For the most part, he doesn't need to, because he's too rich to work, but he just can be on the street. And I think that is a privilege that's afforded to most men of all across stratas. And one final thing that I will say is that what's interesting is that even when a woman is in a Pakistani public space, what's fascinating to me is how the private follows you there. So when you see a man on a street, you see a man on the street. But when you see a woman on the street, you see someone's daughter, or you see someone's mother, or you see someone's wife. And that is, I think, even, we might, whoever, like you might call yourself liberal, you might call yourself whatever, but I think so much of that is very inbuilt into us, and so it's inescapable that the way the private comes into the public all the time.
So the women are relational.
Yes.
Good point.
Adding on to what you said, I was on the completely other spectrum. Because as a man in Pakistan, I had the privilege to loiter around. And when I used to put up photographs, I go out with my camera every year on 14th August. I take lots of pictures. I uploaded them one day. Got a lot of traction, but there was a lot of similar comments. And all the comments were like, where are the women? And these were Pakistani women commenting. Like, there are no women here. And these comments had a lot of likes on them. And there was many. And initially it used to annoy me. I was like, kya yaar, itni achhi tasveeran to liye hain. Like, that kind of thing. Because you're just shielded from your privilege. You don't see it. It wasn't until I traveled outside Pakistan, not to Europe or the West or anything, just to countries in our region. I went to Nepal, I went to Kathmandu, I went to Colombo. And these are people who look like us. We are very similar culturally and everything. But you instantly see the difference. And you see that women are very much an active part of public life over there. The woman over there is not an object how she is viewed over here. And it wasn't until I came back from these trips, you land at Karachi airport and you see it's just 95% are just men. And you just ask yourself, where did the women go? And that was literally the question which was in my mind. The person who will stamp you in at immigration will most likely be a man. All the people in the line are mostly men. If there is a woman, most likely she is with a man. She is probably with her brother, her husband or something. And the one who's probably traveling alone, everyone is probably looking at her a bit differently. And that's when I made a video, a series, which was, where did all the women go? And that's what I continuously ask everyone.
Yeah, I think for me, I have a slightly different context because I grew up I was born in New York and I grew up in America. And for me, I'm also going to talk a little bit about my identity as a poet and my identity as a writer in this because I think it was really influential in terms of thinking about the city. There was this kind of narrative about the poet and about writers as being very learned, and this kind of idea of that really comes from a certain kind of Western whiteness around needing to be amid nature and escape into nature and to have all of the space in nature in order to be able to write. And in America, a lot of the cities are people of color. It's all people of color, and the privilege of even having access to nature is almost the opposite of what you were saying about the village and stuff here, where it's actually having access to nature and to kind of having these more serene spaces and these more serene moments it takes quite an amount of privilege to get that. And actually, the cities have been constructed as places where people of color are, where you have to work, where you're hustling, and where the kind of buildings start to even crowd your ability to see the sky, right? Where you're convoluted by pollution, where you're kind of really, really inundated in this way where those are not quote-unquote nice things, and therefore, how can you be a poet and write about this? And a lot of my experience kind of coming up in the US as a writer was coming up through these communities of writers of color and writers of color who were writing in cities and who didn't have access to this kind of privilege and who were lower class and didn't have the ability to kind of just always go out into nature and then be able to write these magnum opuses. And one of my friends, Nate Marshall, who is a Chicago writer, who wrote two incredible books, one called Finna and one called The Hundreds, and which are both kind of about the idea of language, vernacular, and the city, really kind of talked to me and kind of coined this idea of the urban pastoral. And what does it mean? So in poetic language, the pastoral is the idea of the nature of being amid the greenery, being amid the lushness, being amid the trees, and then was well, what happens when we actually think about the urban spaces as vivid as that, as lush as that, as capable of capturing such beautiful poetry, and what happens when we start to really embrace the idea of vernacular, of colloquial, of including that in our work, of including that in our engine, so that becomes the nature of what we're writing about, and that that's not seen as inferior. Instead, it's seen as being worthy of being included in poetry, being worthy of being included in literature, being worthy of being written about and being talked about and being held in this way, you know? And I think, to me, even growing up, like, there was this idea that, like, nature was for white people, like going into nature, going into the greenery, doing things like skiing, all of this stuff was for white. It was a really privileged thing to be able to do. And it actually took quite a bit of unlearning for me to even understand that nature was accessible and available to all of us. And that we all had a right to be able to kind of commune with trees, to be able to sit in grass, to be able to have this kind of access that was so different than what I had grown up with. And so in terms of my own kind of poetic and literary approach, so much of what populates my writing has been this tension between the city and the, you know, the more natural sprawling landscape, and also this kind of exploration of how do you kind of be in right relationship with land, how do you kind of build this relationship where you can be in nature and it feels really, really beautiful, particularly when you come from the city and when you come from this place where it's also a bit devalued and looked down upon.
It's really interesting because I'm thinking about your